When I took my seat at the VIP table inside Chicago's The Vanguard Art Gallery for my mother's annual charity gala, I knew a trap was being set. My sister, Natalie, shimmering in a gaudy sequined gown, waited patiently for the waiters to finish pouring the expensive champagne. As soon as they stepped away, she struck, with a condescending smirk, she slid a neon pink 25% discount voucher and a cheap plastic clothes folder name tag across the velvet tablecloth directly into my lap. Projecting her voice so all 40 elite guests could hear, she announced she was offering me a pity job at her fast fashion boutique, Lumiere, for minimum wage. The entire table went dead silent, waiting for me to break. But as I stared down at that plastic name tag, I felt nothing but calm, because they had absolutely no idea that I had just bought Natalie's entire company. If you've ever had a toxic family member try to publicly destroy your dignity, you know the exact chill that ran down my spine. Subscribe and listen to how I took everything from them. 4 years ago, I made the single decision that permanently destroyed my standing in our family's hierarchy. I walked into my parents' immaculate living room and calmly announced that I was dropping out of a prestigious Chicago law school. I did not want to spend my life buried in corporate litigation. I had a burning vision to pursue sustainable, ethical fashion and build a brand that actually meant something. The family blowout was immediate and deafening. Richard paced the hardwood floor, his face flushed with absolute rage, shouting that I was an embarrassment, throwing my entire future away for a foolish pipe dream. Susan simply looked at me with cold, unadulterated disgust. They cut me off entirely that very afternoon. They refused to give me a single cent for my design ambitions, locking away the college funds and completely severing their financial support. Whenever their elite friends asked about me, Richard and Susan would proudly claim they were practicing tough love, insisting they were just trying to teach me a harsh lesson about the real world. But I knew exactly what they were doing. They completely normalized their cruelty toward me under that false guise of tough love, because it served as a convenient psychological defense mechanism. It was infinitely easier for them to freeze me out and label me a failure than to admit they had a daughter who dared to defy their rigid, status-obsessed expectations. My choices threatened their deeply fragile social image, so they simply erased me from their narrative to protect their own egos. The hypocrisy of it all was staggering, especially because a mere week later, Richard handed Natalie a massive, unearned business loan with 0 questions asked. She did not have to write a business plan or prove her worth. He simply wrote a check so she could start her cheap fast fashion empire, Lumiere. She used his money to flood the market with low-quality synthetic garments, and my parents relentlessly paraded her around as the brilliant entrepreneur of the family. I was left with absolutely nothing, but I refused to let their rejection break me. Instead, I used their doubt as my ultimate fuel. I worked grueling 14-hour shifts at a greasy diner on State Street. I would drag myself home at 2 a.m, smelling like old frying oil and sheer exhaustion. But I never allowed myself to sleep. Every single tip I earned went directly toward buying raw, organic hemp fabrics and natural dyes. I spent the darkest, coldest hours of the night meticulously constructing my first Verdant Threads collection on a broken $45 thrifted Singer sewing machine in a freezing, unheated basement apartment. My fingers would bleed and my back would ache, but I kept sewing, pouring every ounce of my soul into grinding in the shadows. And that relentless grind paid off. By my 3rd year, my online orders exploded, catching the attention of major ethical retailers. Finally, I secured a massive buyout from an ethical investment firm that wanted to scale my brand globally. The negotiations took agonizing months, but when the contracts were signed, I retained complete creative control while walking away with a massive multi-million-dollar buyout. I was suddenly wealthier than Richard, Susan, and Natalie combined. I could have called them the second the funds cleared, but I wanted my peace. I let them keep thinking I was the ultimate family disappointment, never realizing I had built an unstoppable empire. Now, 4 years later, the sheer arrogance of my family was on full display. The charity gala was Susan's absolute crowning social achievement of the year. She had meticulously curated every single detail of this evening to raise funds, but more importantly, to elevate her own status among Chicago's elite. The towering floral arrangements imported from Europe, the crystal chandeliers reflecting off the polished marble floors, the string quartet playing softly in the background. It was all carefully designed to project an image of flawless, untouchable wealth. I sat quietly at the edge of the VIP table, sipping my sparkling water and observing the elaborate performance unfolding around me. Before the first course was even cleared, Susan leaned over, her heavy floral perfume momentarily suffocating. She gripped my arm tightly under the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "Do not embarrass us tonight, Alyssa," she hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper intended only for me. "If anyone asks what you are doing with your life, just tell them you are exploring your options. I absolutely forbid you from mentioning that failing sewing hobby of yours to anyone here. We have a prestigious image to maintain." I simply nodded, keeping my expression perfectly blank. I let her patronize me. I let her feel utterly superior, knowing that her entire reality was about to shatter. The real show began when Natalie confidently strode up to the grand stage. She grabbed the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who fully believed her own manufactured hype. For 7 agonizing minutes, I sat there as she delivered a speech entirely dedicated to praising her own business acumen. She bragged to the captivated audience about her thriving retail chain, inflating her sales numbers and speaking grandly about her supposed ethical sourcing practices. It was utterly nauseating. She did not thank our parents for the massive loan that had built her brand. She simply stood there, soaking up the applause, bathing in the admiration of the city's wealthiest socialites as if she were a self-made genius. When the applause finally died down, Natalie stepped off the stage, her eyes scanning the room until they locked directly onto me. She had that specific, toxic gleam in her eye, the look of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. She marched straight toward the VIP table, her sequined gown catching the light with every step, her focus entirely on tearing me down. This brings us back to the moment she struck. Standing right over my shoulder, she let out a loud, theatrical sigh of pity. She slid the neon pink 25% discount voucher and the cheap plastic clothes folder name tag across the velvet tablecloth. It stopped directly next to my plate. "I know your little sewing project hasn't really worked out, Alyssa," Natalie announced. Her voice projected so that every single person at our table and the surrounding ones could hear every word. "Mom and Dad are so incredibly worried about your future. So, I talked to my regional manager. I called in a huge favor. If you take this name tag tonight, I can guarantee you a spot on the sales floor on Monday. It is time to stop being the family disappointment and get a real job." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations abruptly ceased. The wealthy donors and socialites stared at me, their faces caught somewhere between shock and morbid curiosity. I glanced at my father. Richard leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his bourbon, and actually chuckled aloud. He found my public humiliation amusing. I looked at my mother. Susan simply looked down at her plate. She pretended to be embarrassed by Natalie's outburst, but I could see the faint smirk playing on her lips. She was secretly relishing this. They both were. They desperately needed this power dynamic. They needed me to be the broken, desperate failure, so they could feel large, successful, and generous. They were waiting for me to break down. They were waiting for me to cry, to apologize for being a burden, to beg them for a scrap of their manufactured success. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply looked at the plastic name tag and smiled. The silence that swept through the grand hall of the gallery was absolute and deeply suffocating. The soft murmurs of the wealthy guests and the gentle melodies of the string quartet had vanished entirely, replaced by a tense, heavy anticipation. You could have heard a pin drop against the polished marble floor. Every single eye at our table, and from the dozens of guests seated nearby, was locked onto my face. They were watching me like predators, circling wounded prey, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. They wanted to see me completely crumble under the weight of my sister's cruel public ambush. They fully expected me to burst into humiliated tears, to violently push back my chair, and to flee from the sparkling room in absolute shame. It was the only script they knew, and it perfectly fulfilled my designated role as the tragic, defeated outcast of the family. My parents sat frozen, practically holding their breath as they waited for my spirit to finally shatter. But they did not realize that the terrified girl they had thrown out 4 years ago no longer existed. Instead of crying, I reached out with a slow, deliberate calmness and picked up the neon pink 25% discount voucher. I could feel my mother's gaze burning into my skin, silently pleading with me to run away and hide. Ignoring her, I smoothed the cheap paper's edges, folded it meticulously in half, and then handed it right back to my sister. I looked up and offered her a serene, completely untroubled smile that made her arrogant expression falter. "I genuinely appreciate the charitable gesture, Natalie," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and crystal clear so it carried across the quiet space. "But I am afraid that I simply do not need a $14 an hour job at Lumiere. Taking a pay cut to fold cheap synthetic sweaters just does not make logical sense for my current portfolio." Natalie's smug smile twisted into a sneer of utter confusion, her heavily contoured face wrinkling as she tried to comprehend my total lack of embarrassment. "A pay cut?" she scoffed loudly. "You do not have a portfolio, Alyssa. You sew rags in a basement." I did not give her a chance to spew any more of her toxic poison. Without dropping my gaze from hers, I reached into my elegant designer clutch. I pulled out a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. It was embossed with the prestigious crest of First Chicago Bank. I held it for just a fraction of a second, letting the gravity of the moment build, before I slammed it down onto the white velvet tablecloth. The heavy, expensive thud echoed sharply in the dead quiet room, vibrating through the crystal glasses and making my mother physically jump in her seat. I reached forward, unclasped the portfolio, and withdrew the thick stack of documents hidden inside. It was a fully executed, countersigned 12-page acquisition agreement. I slid the pristine paperwork directly across the white velvet, pushing it right up against Natalie's porcelain dinner plate, where she, my mother, and my father had a perfect view of the bold black ink. "My holding company, Aura Eco Investments, finalized the acquisition of your primary creditors and all of your collateralized debt exactly 48 hours ago," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority. I watched my sister's eyes drop to the paper, tracking the corporate logos and the final signature lines. Right there, in undeniable, legally binding black and white, were the signatures of the shadow private equity firm that held the toxic loans she had desperately taken out. She had secretly used her controlling majority shares as collateral to keep Lumiere afloat, and my holding company had just bought that entire debt portfolio. Natalie let out a harsh, shaking gasp, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as she shoved the 12-page document away from her plate. "You are a liar," she stammered, her voice suddenly high-pitched and leaking pure desperation. "This is a sick, pathetic joke. You do not have an investment company. You are a college dropout." I smiled, leaning back comfortably in my chair, savoring the exact moment her reality began to collapse. "I do not need to print fake documents, Natalie," I replied smoothly, projecting my voice so the surrounding tables caught every devastating word. "And I certainly do not need a fake job at a company that is currently drowning in $4.2 million of unpaid supplier invoices." The color instantly and completely drained from Natalie's face, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. She looked like all the air had been violently knocked from her lungs. That exact figure, $4.2 million, was the deeply buried, closely guarded financial secret she had been hiding from everyone, including our own parents. She had been living on the absolute brink of total financial collapse, desperate for a bailout, and I was the one holding all of her debt. The exact figure, $4.2 million, hung in the dead, suffocating air of the Vanguard Art Gallery, acting as the ultimate double twist that elevated the conflict from a petty family squabble to a profound moral and financial reckoning. Natalie's perfectly contoured face contorted into a grotesque mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. The neon pink discount voucher she had so arrogantly wielded moments ago now lay forgotten, completely and utterly dwarfed by the heavy, red wax-sealed folder that represented the absolute shift in our power dynamic. She looked around frantically, searching for a lifeline among the staring socialites, but the elite crowd, the very people whose approval she craved, like oxygen, were now looking at her with a chilling mixture of pity and disgust. Richard, finally realizing the catastrophic gravity of the situation, pushed his chair back so violently it screeched against the polished marble floor. His face, previously flushed with cruel amusement, was now a dangerous, stormy purple. The psychological phenomenon of narcissistic injury was unfolding in real time right before my eyes. His entire identity, his carefully curated image of absolute control, immense wealth, and infallible business acumen was fracturing under the weight of this unsparing public exposure. "Alyssa, enough of this absolute nonsense," Richard barked, stepping toward me with his fists clenched, desperately trying to reassert his patriarchal dominance. "You are making a hysterical scene. Whatever forged, garbage documents you brought here tonight to ruin your mother's gala." "They aren't forged, Richard," I said, deliberately dropping the title of Dad, locking eyes with him. My voice was a calm, steady anchor of quiet resilience, a stark contrast to his rising, uncontrollable panic. And the truth is, it gets so much worse. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out a second document, a sleek black envelope that contained the deepest, most destructive secret of all. This was the moment the stakes were raised to an absolute peak, proving that their cruelty was built on a foundation of profound betrayal and staggering financial recklessness. "When you gave Natalie that unearned business loan 4 years ago to start Lumiere, you didn't just write a check," I stated, my words cutting through the silent room like a scalpel. "You co-signed her commercial leases. You heavily leveraged the family estate. You tied your entire financial legacy to a fast fashion brand that was inherently toxic and fundamentally unsustainable." Susan gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She whipped her head toward Richard, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. "Richard? What is she talking about? You said the estate was completely secure." "He lied to you, Susan," I replied calmly, watching the last remnants of their unified family facade crumble. Natalie's suppliers were preparing to file a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit for breach of contract. Lumiere was 48 hours away from catastrophic, very public bankruptcy. If those lawsuits hit, they wouldn't just take her cheap synthetic clothing empire. They would take the house, the trust funds, and this very charity foundation to cover the damages. It was a masterclass in karmic justice, watching the villains of my life realize that their own blinding greed and arrogant incompetence had dug their graves. Natalie, desperate to reclaim her shattered narrative, made the fatal, foolish mistake of escalating the conflict into a public, uncontrollable meltdown. "You set me up!" Natalie screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek that echoed off the gallery's high ceilings. She lunged forward, her sequined gown tearing slightly as she slammed her hands onto the table. "You deliberately bought out my suppliers just to ruin me! You're a vindictive, jealous little freak who couldn't stand that I was the favorite." Dozens of smartphones were suddenly raised in the dim light of the gala, camera lenses pointed directly at the VIP table. Natalie was executing her own public self-destruction, completely unraveling in front of the very high society peers she had spent her entire life trying to impress. The footage would be viral by morning, cementing her downfall in the very social circles she prized above all else. "I didn't set you up, Natalie," I answered, my tone reflecting the deep, hard-won peace of someone who had survived their abuse and rebuilt her life from the ground up. "You ruined yourself. You bought cheap, toxic materials. You exploited overseas labor, and you arrogantly refused to pay the people who actually built your inventory. I simply bought the debt that you were too incompetent and too entitled to manage." I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and profoundly unhurried. I smoothed the skirt of my understated, organic hemp gown, a piece from my own verdant threads collection. "I am not here for petty revenge," I said, looking at the three people who had discarded me so easily. "I am here for absolute justice. As your majority creditor, my holding company will be foreclosing on your shares and liquidating Lumiere's assets starting Monday morning to pay back the suppliers you cheated. As for the family estate, well, my lawyers will be in touch regarding your remaining liabilities." The complete, unmitigated silence of the gallery followed me as I turned my back on them and walked away. I didn't need to stay and watch them pick up the pieces of their ruined empire. I had severed the toxic ties that bound me to their cruelty, choosing to walk away with my dignity and my self-made success. Around me, the grand hall of the Vanguard Art Gallery remained trapped in a suffocating, absolute silence. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. Richard's face was a grotesque mask of purple, impotent fury. Susan was clutching her throat, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and Natalie simply sat there, looking as though the polished marble floor had opened up and swallowed her entire fabricated identity. They were frozen, terrified statues in a museum of their own arrogant making. For my entire life, I had craved their approval, twisted myself into knots, trying to be enough, trying to earn a place at their table. Now, looking at their shattered expressions, I realized I never needed a seat at their table. I owned the building. I didn't offer a goodbye, a gloating remark, or a final, dramatic exit line. They didn't deserve my words. I simply turned my back on them and walked away, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm against the floor that echoed like a gavel striking a judge's block. The cool, crisp night air hit my flushed face as I pushed through the heavy glass doors and exited the gallery. It felt like taking my very first real breath in over 2 decades. The oppressive weight of their constant judgment, the suffocating need to please them, it was all completely gone, left behind in that room with the remnants of Natalie's shattered empire. I handed a generous tip to the valet, offering him a warm, genuine smile, a stark contrast to the sneers my family usually reserved for service staff. Moments later, I was sliding into the quiet, pristine back seat of my private electric sedan. As the driver smoothly pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window. I didn't look back at the glowing, artificial lights of the gala. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the road ahead. A few months later, the inevitable, chaotic collapse finally echoed into my world. I was in my bright, sunlit downtown studio, surrounded by organic fabric swatches and vibrant mood boards, when my phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed with Susan's name. Against my better judgment, I let it go to voicemail, and then, morbidly curious, I pressed play. What followed was a frantic, deeply pathetic 3-minute recording of pure, unadulterated panic. Susan was hysterically crying, her voice cracking and pitching as she shrieked over the loud, mechanical sound of a tow truck in the background. The repo men were currently in their pristine suburban driveway, hooking heavy chains to Richard's prized silver Mercedes. The bank had finally come to collect, but the truly devastating part, the core revelation of who they really were, amidst the total collapse of their fraudulent, leveraged empire, she wasn't calling to apologize for a lifetime of cruelty. She was begging me to urgently wire her exactly $8,000 to save their prestigious country club membership before they were publicly expelled. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof that they hadn't learned a single thing. Their priorities were still anchored firmly to empty status, shallow appearances, and toxic entitlement. Listening to her sob over a country club membership while her husband's car was repossessed, I didn't feel a shred of anger anymore. Nor did I feel the crippling, paralyzing guilt they had meticulously trained me to carry since childhood. I just felt a profound, cleansing realization. Some people are simply broken beyond repair. Without a second thought, I deleted the voicemail with one simple, final tap. Then, I went into my settings and blocked their numbers permanently. Every single one of them. The silence that followed wasn't suffocating like the silence in the gallery. It was the beautiful, expansive, healing silence of total freedom. I picked up my charcoal pencil, took a deep breath, and went back to finalizing my sketches. I was absolutely determined not to let their toxicity define my legacy. True justice isn't just about watching the wicked fall and reveling in their destruction. It's about what you choose to build in the space they leave behind. It's about breaking the cycle. Using the considerable profits and newly acquired assets from Aura Eco Investments, I officially launched the Verdant Future Foundation. It is a comprehensive incubator program specifically designed to fully fund, house, and mentor young, underprivileged eco-designers who have the raw talent but lack the financial resources to start. I wanted to make absolutely certain that no other passionate, creative kid was ever told their dreams were worthless, impossible, or a waste of money simply because they didn't fit a predetermined mold. Every single time I walk into the foundation and see one of my students succeeding, smiling, and creating, I know I've won. Sometimes the best revenge isn't tearing them down, but building an empire they can't touch. If you've ever had to walk away from a toxic family to find your true worth, drop a comment below and subscribe for more stories of surviving and thriving.